She opened the box the same way she had opened 1,000 boxes before it. Carefully, both hands. The flaps folded back in order, left then right, the way she had always done it, the way that kept the corners from tearing. Donated books smelled a specific way, dust and time and the particular residue of other people's lives pressed between pages. And Evelyn Marsh had learned to love that smell across 35 years of cataloging other people's discarded reading. The box was unremarkable, 22 books, mostly hardcovers, mostly old. An estate donation from the family of Harold Finch, 89, who had died the previous Tuesday and whose obituary described him as a retired schoolteacher, a deacon of the First Baptist Church, a man who loved fishing and his grandchildren and had lived his whole life within 40 miles of the town of Crestfield, Ohio. Evelyn had not known Harold Finch, not in this life. She lifted the books out one by one, stacking them on the cataloging table to her left. Fiction, history, a well-worn Bible with a cracked spine, a 1969 almanac, a 1971 almanac. The envelope fell from between the pages of the 1971 almanac and landed on the cataloging table face up. Evelyn saw her name and stopped breathing. Not the name on her library badge. Not the name on her Ohio driver's license. Not the name on the deed to her small house on Elm Street, or the name her colleagues used when they greeted her each morning, or the name the children called her when they came in on Saturday mornings for story hour. The other name. The name that had belonged to a person who no longer officially existed. The name she had not seen written anywhere in 53 years. She stood very still for a long time. The library was quiet around her. Tuesday morning, 11 o'clock, no patrons yet. The fluorescent light above the cataloging table made its faint hum. Outside the window, Crestfield, Ohio went about its Tuesday the way it always did, unhurried and unaware. Evelyn Marsh picked up the envelope. Her hands were not shaking. She was 78 years old, and she had learned, across a very long and very carefully constructed life, to receive difficult things without shaking. She turned the envelope over, sealed, her name written on the front in a careful, deliberate hand. Someone who took their time with letters. Someone who understood that certain things deserved the dignity of care. She did not open it immediately. She set it down on the cataloging table beside the 1971 almanac. She finished cataloging the remaining books from Harold Finch's estate, all 22 of them, entered into the system in order, spine labels applied with precision, stacked neatly for shelving. She took her time. This was deliberate. The deliberateness was a form of preparation, the way you prepare for something by doing ordinary things in the ordinary order, because the ordinary things are the scaffolding that holds you upright when the extraordinary thing arrives. She had learned this across 78 years, not as a philosophy, as a practice. You do the ordinary thing first. You finish what you started. Then you turn to face what is waiting. She finished the cataloging. She logged each item in the system. She applied the spine labels with the small label gun she had been using for 15 years, each one aligned precisely, the way they had always been aligned. She stacked the books. She noted the donation in the estate file under Harold Finch's name. Then she locked the front door of the library, something she had done in the middle of a working day exactly once in 35 years. She sat down at the cataloging table. She opened the envelope. What happened next would not make sense without understanding who Evelyn Marsh appeared to be, and what Evelyn Marsh appeared to be to everyone in Crestfield, Ohio, who had known her for the past 35 years, was this: the librarian. Not just a librarian, the librarian. The one who had been there so long she was less a person than a feature of the building, like the old card catalog that still sat in the corner, even though everything was digital now, kept because nobody could quite bring themselves to remove something that had been part of the place for so long. She was 78 years old, small and precise, with silver hair kept in a neat bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the particular quality of stillness that develops in people who spend their lives in rooms where quiet is a professional requirement. She wore cardigans. She wore them in autumn colors in autumn, and spring colors in spring, and on the coldest winter days, a dark wool one that had belonged to her late husband Robert, who had died of a heart attack in 2003, and whose absence she carried the way you carry the loss of a thing that was so present for so long, that the space it leaves is its own kind of presence. She knew every family in Crestfield. She knew their reading habits and their children's reading habits, and in many cases their grandchildren's reading habits. She knew who preferred mysteries and who preferred history, and who came in every 2 weeks like clockwork for large print romances, and who brought their toddlers on Tuesday mornings for story hour even when the weather was bad, because the library was warm and the librarian was patient and the picture books were good. She had been at the ribbon cutting when the library was renovated in 1998. She had organized the fundraising drive when the roof needed replacing in 2007. She had stayed open through 3 snowstorms, a tornado warning, and the week the furnace broke in January 2015, when she brought in 3 space heaters from home and wore her coat all day rather than close the doors to the people who needed somewhere warm to be. That was Evelyn Marsh. That was who the town of Crestfield, Ohio believed she was. And she was all of those things, every one of them, genuinely. But she was also something else, something she had not told anyone in 53 years. Something that lived beneath the cardigans and the reading glasses and the neat silver bun and the Tuesday morning story hours with a persistence and a weight that 53 years had not diminished, had in fact only clarified, the way that certain things become more rather than less visible as time passes, the way a scar becomes more defined as the surrounding skin softens. She had a secret, and Harold Finch, who had lived and died 40 miles from Crestfield without ever once walking through the library's doors, had known it. From which city are you watching today? Drop it in the comments. And if stories about the weight people carry in silence, and what happens when someone finally sets it down, speak to you, subscribe. Because what Evelyn found in that envelope had been written 10 years ago by a man who had decided to forgive her before she ever thought to ask. And what she did with that forgiveness will stay with you. But first, understand something about the box, about what it means that Harold Finch, 89 years old, in the last years of his life, had organized his personal library in such a way that the almanac containing the envelope was included in the books he intended to donate. This was not an accident. He had known his estate would be donated. He had chosen which books to include. He had placed the envelope between the pages of the 1971 almanac, not the 1969, not any other year, the 1971, and he had written her name on the front. The name that would mean nothing to his family. The name that would mean everything to the librarian who received the box. He had constructed a path that required his family to donate the books, required them to choose the right library, required the librarian on duty to open the box and catalog the books herself rather than delegating to a volunteer, required the envelope to fall out at the right moment, required the librarian to be the right person. He had trusted all of those things to work out. And they had. That is a specific kind of faith. The faith that the right thing, properly aimed, will find its target. The faith that a person who has been building something for 35 years in the only language available to them will eventually be understood in that language. The faith that forgiveness, sent in the right direction with enough patience, will arrive. Harold Finch had been a school teacher for 30 years. He had spent his career believing that information placed correctly and tended patiently would eventually reach the person who needed it. He had applied that belief one final time to one specific person in a box of donated books left to a small-town library in Ohio. The librarian opened the box and found it. That is the whole story, and it begins exactly the way she always began, with her hands in a box and a careful unfolding. Evelyn Marsh was born in 1946 in Cleveland, Ohio. Her father was a postal worker. Her mother taught elementary school. They were people of modest means and large expectations, the specific combination that produces either bitterness or drive depending on the character of the person it shapes. And in Evelyn's case, it produced drive of the quiet, sustained variety that does not announce itself but does not stop. She was the first person in her family to attend university. Ohio State, 1964. English literature, then library science. She was precise and organized and loved books with the specific love of someone for whom books had been, growing up, the primary available transportation to anywhere other than where she was. The love of books and the love of access to books were not the same love, though they were related. The first was personal, the private pleasure of reading, of being inside a good sentence, of the specific experience of a story that opens something in you. The second was political, in the most grounded and unglamorous sense of the word political. The understanding that access to information was not evenly distributed, and that the uneven distribution was not accidental, and that the people who controlled access to knowledge controlled, in a consequential and often invisible way, the possibilities available to everyone else. She had understood this first in her parents' house, where the public library branch 3 miles away had been the primary source of books because buying them was not consistently affordable, and where the quality of what was available at that branch determined the quality of what she could read, which determined the quality of what she could think about, which determined the quality of what she could become. She had gone into library science because she understood that the person who builds and maintains and opens the door of the collection is not a passive keeper of objects, but an active architect of possibility. She had believed this at 21. She believed it at 78. It had never once wavered. She met Robert Marsh in her final year of graduate school. He was studying architecture, quiet, precise, the kind of man who measured things before cutting them, and who brought that same quality of care to everything he did, including loving her. They married in 1969, which was after she had already gone south, which was a fact she had managed with a careful construction of partial truths. She had told him she had been doing community organizing in Alabama. She had not told him the name she had used. She had not told him about April 14th, 1971. He had not asked with the specific insistence that would have required her to tell him, perhaps because he was perceptive enough to understand that there were rooms in his wife that she had not opened to him, and wise enough to love her from outside those rooms without forcing the doors. He died in 2003, having never known. Evelyn had decided, somewhere in the late 1980s, that telling him would be for her benefit rather than his, and had maintained the decision with the same quiet discipline she brought to everything. She was not sure, 20 years after his death, whether this had been the right decision. She was not sure it had been the wrong one. It was simply the decision she had made, one of many she carried in the ledger she kept. She was also, by the time she was a junior at Ohio State, politically awake in a way that 1966 made almost inevitable for a young person paying attention. The civil rights movement had been reshaping the country for a decade. The news came in every night with footage that was impossible to watch passively. Dogs and fire hoses and men in suits explaining calmly why the people being attacked deserved what was happening to them. Evelyn watched this from a university library in Columbus, Ohio, and felt the specific fury of a person who understands that watching from a safe distance is its own kind of choice. She started attending meetings, then organizing meetings. Then, in the summer of 1968, she made a decision that her parents would not know about for years, and that the state of Alabama would eventually know about in ways she had not anticipated. She went south. She was 22 years old. She had a degree in library science and a talent for logistics and a belief, fierce and uncompromising in the way that 22-year-old beliefs tend to be, that the distance between what the country claimed to be and what it actually was could be closed if enough people were willing to do the unglamorous work of closing it. Voter registration, community organizing, the slow, patient labor of building infrastructure in communities that the state had spent generations trying to keep from building anything. She worked under a different name from the beginning. That was standard practice, safety measure. The people who organized in those communities were not always welcomed by the local authorities, and a name that could not be easily traced was a practical tool rather than a deception. Her organizing name was simple, 2 syllables. She had chosen it herself on the drive south, and had inhabited it so completely within 6 months that her given name began to feel like something from another life. She was good at the work, extremely good. The same qualities that had made her an exceptional student, the precision, the organizational instinct, the patience, the ability to hold multiple complex things in mind simultaneously, turned out to be exactly what community organizing required. She was not charismatic in the traditional sense. She did not give speeches. She built systems. She created networks. She connected people who needed to know each other and organized logistics that made larger actions possible and kept records that would matter later. Careful, detailed records in notebooks she kept in a waterproof box that she moved from location to location. The people she worked with in Alabama were not abstractions. They were specific. Earl, who ran the barber shop and whose back room had become the unofficial headquarters for 3 counties, and who made the best coffee she had ever tasted, and who talked about his grandchildren with a pride so large it seemed to make him taller. Josephine, who was 70, and had been doing this work since before Evelyn was born, and who had a way of looking at young people from the north who came south full of urgency that communicated, without words, that the urgency was welcome and the humility needed work. Harold Finch, who was 36 and meticulous, who kept better records than anyone, and who had a talent for logistics that mirrored her own, and with whom she had spent hundreds of hours at tables covered in documents, working through the specific, unglamorous architecture of how change actually happened. She thought about these people often across the 53 years that followed. Not every day, but often, in the specific way that people think about the most real version of themselves they have ever inhabited, with a mixture of grief and recognition and the specific ache of something irretrievable. By 1971, she had been in Alabama for 3 years. She was 25. She was not the same person who had driven south from Columbus with a single bag and a fierce, uncomplicated belief. She was someone more complicated. Someone who had seen enough to understand that the work was longer and harder and less clean than she had believed, and who had chosen to do it anyway, and who had found in that choosing something that felt like the truest version of herself she had ever inhabited. And then came the night of April 14th, 1971. She did not think about that night every day. That was something people assumed, that a person who carried something as heavy as what she carried must think about it constantly, must be oppressed by it every waking hour. That was not how it worked. The thing she carried had integrated itself into her so completely over 53 years that it was less a thought she had than a quality of the air around everything she did. It was always present the way gravity is always present, not something you think about, but something that shapes every movement you make. What it had shaped, she understood now, was everything. The library, obviously, the collection, the particular thoroughness with which she had built the civil rights section, the specific books she had prioritized acquiring, the oral history archive she had spent 10 years establishing through grant applications and personal solicitations of people who had been present at significant events and whose accounts deserved to be preserved. But also, the way she listened to people, the patience she had with young people who came in not knowing what they were looking for, the instinct to keep the doors open when it would have been easier to close them, the belief, which she had held for 35 years without fully examining its origins, that a library was not a building that held books but a structure that held access to knowledge, to history, to the record of what people had done and believed and suffered and built, and that maintaining that access was not a professional obligation, but a moral one. She had been building her response to April 14, 1971, for 35 years. She had built it in the only form available to her, and it had been visible to the one person who knew what to look for from 40 miles away. The weeks before April 14, 1971, had carried a quality of tension that was different from the ordinary tension of the work. Something had changed in the county in the preceding months. A series of legal victories in voter registration cases had shifted something in the local power structure, not resolved it, but moved it. And when things shift without resolving, they often generate a specific kind of pressure that builds in ways that are not always visible until they release. Evelyn had felt it. Harold had felt it. Josephine, who had been doing this work since before most of them were born, had said, "Something is coming. Be careful." They had been careful. They had taken the precautions they always took. The precautions were not enough. What happened on April 14, 1971, in a community meeting room in a small Alabama town was this: a confrontation between the people gathered for an organizing meeting and a group of men who had no legal authority to enter the building but entered it anyway, which was not in itself unusual, which had happened before. What was different this night was the presence of a weapon that should not have been there, on the wrong side of the room, in hands that were not steady, and the shot that came from those hands, and the man who fell, and the chaos that followed. One person died, a local officer. The circumstances were disputed then and remained disputed in the documents that followed. 3 people were arrested and charged. They were convicted in a trial that lasted 4 days in a county where the outcome of such trials was not difficult to predict. They served their sentences, 4 years each, and were released and returned to their lives. Evelyn was not arrested. She was not in the room when the shot was fired. She had left 20 minutes earlier to retrieve documents from the car. She heard the shot from the parking lot. She stood beside her car in the dark Alabama night and listened to the sound of everything collapsing and made a decision in the space of 30 seconds that she had spent the next 53 years interrogating. She drove away. She did not go back. She drove north through the night and called a contact in Cincinnati the next morning and began the process of becoming someone else. A new name, a new identity, a return to Ohio. A library science career built quietly and carefully in a small town far enough from everything that the past could not easily find her. She told herself she had left because she was not guilty. She had not been in the room. The shot had not come from her. She had not owned a weapon. She told herself this for 53 years, and it remained true, and it also remained insufficient in a way she could not fully articulate, and had stopped trying to articulate sometime in the 1980s, when Robert was still alive and the library was still new, and the weight of it had compressed into something she could live around rather than something she had to actively manage every day. The 3 people who were arrested had names. She knew their names. She had known them personally, worked beside them, eaten meals with them, understood their specific talents and commitments, and the specific courage it took to do what they were doing in the place and time they were doing it. She had followed the trial from Cincinnati through newspaper accounts, reading each update with a specific cold attention that was also a form of penance. She had read the verdict. She had read the sentencing. She had sat in her Cincinnati apartment on the day the sentences were announced and felt something move through her that she still did not have a precise name for, something that was constructed from equal parts guilt and grief and fury, and the specific cold clarity of a person who understands exactly what has happened and exactly what her part in it is. She had thought about going back. She had thought about it seriously for about 3 weeks following the sentencing, had considered what it would mean and what it would cost, and whether the cost would produce anything useful for the people who had been convicted, or whether it would merely be a gesture toward her own conscience at the expense of her freedom. She had concluded, and she had concluded it honestly rather than conveniently, that going back would not help them. It might shorten their sentences if she provided testimony, or it might not, depending on the judge and the circumstances and the specific unpredictability of that county's legal machinery in 1971. And it would certainly end her, not physically, but in every other sense. She had chosen not to go back. She had lived with that choice for 53 years. She had never been entirely sure it had been wrong. She had never been entirely sure it had been right. It had simply been what she had done, and the doing of it had shaped everything that followed the way a stone dropped in water shapes the rings that expand from it, determining without determining, causing without intending. One of them was named Harold Finch. He had been 36 years old when he was convicted. He had served 4 years in an Alabama state prison. He had been released in 1975. We had returned to Ohio, not to Cincinnati, not to Crestfield, but to a town 40 miles away. And he had become a school teacher and a deacon, and a man who loved fishing and his grandchildren, which was how his obituary described him, which was true, which was also an incomplete accounting of who he had been and what he had carried. Evelyn had tracked all three of them at a distance across the years. Not obtrusively, not in any way that could have been called surveillance. But she had needed to know they were alive and that they were, in some sense, all right. She owed them that knowledge at minimum. She owed them far more than that. Harold Finch had been 40 miles away for decades. She had not known. She unfolded the letter. It was 2 pages, written in the same careful, deliberate hand as the envelope, dated 3 years ago, which meant he had written it 2 years before he tracked down where she was, and then held it for another year before placing it in the almanac, and then died with the question of whether she would ever find it, depending entirely on whether his family donated his books to the right library. She read it once quickly, then she sat for a long time, then she read it again slowly, the way you read things that require the full attention of everything you are. The letter did not accuse, it did not demand, it did not ask for anything at all. It said, "I have known where you were for 10 years. I found you by accident. A photograph in a small-town newspaper, a library fundraising event, 2013. You were standing in front of a shelf of books with your hand raised towards something on a high shelf, and the light was behind you, and I recognized the way you stood. I always remembered the way you stood. Some people carry themselves in a way that stays with you." It said, "I want you to know that I thought about contacting you for a long time. I decided not to. Not because I was angry, though I was, for a while, many years ago, angry in the way that prison makes you angry, which is a specific and comprehensive kind of angry that I would not wish on anyone. But I stopped being angry about you specifically a long time ago, because I understood something about that night that I do not think you have ever allowed yourself to understand. It said, you were not responsible for what happened. I was there. I know what happened. The circumstances that produced that night were the result of many people's decisions over many years, and none of those decisions were yours alone. You left. That is what you did. It was not heroic. But it was not the thing you seem to have been punishing yourself for all these years. Because I have read about the library and the things you have built there, and a person who was only running would not have built those things. It said, I forgave you a long time ago. I am telling you this now because I am old and you are old, and there is no reason to carry something this heavy into whatever comes next. Put it down. You have earned the right to put it down. It said, what we were doing was right. Even though everything went wrong. Even though I spent 4 years in a place I should not have been. What we were doing was right. And I believed it then, and I believe it now. And I want you to hold that alongside the other thing, because they are both true and you have been holding only one of them for 50 years. It was signed with his full name, Harold James Finch, and beneath his name in smaller letters, Crestfield Public Library. Your section on the civil rights movement is the best I have seen outside of a university collection. I went to 3 other libraries before I found yours. You always did know how to build a collection. Evelyn sat in the locked library for a long time. Outside, Crestfield went about its Tuesday, but that wasn't the full story, because the letter was not the end. It was the beginning of something that would require Evelyn Marsh, at 78 years old, to do the thing she had been unable to do for 53 years. Not carry the weight differently, not manage it better. Set it down, in public, with witnesses, and that was a different thing entirely. She sat with the letter for a long time after her second reading. She sat with what Harold Finch had written about the collection. "Your section on the civil rights movement is the best I have seen outside a university collection," and understood, for the first time, what the collection had been. She had told herself, across 35 years, that it was professional interest, that it was simply doing her job thoroughly, curating a collection that served the community well, providing access to history that deserved to be accessible. These things were all true. They were also incomplete. They were the part of the truth that she had allowed herself to see because it did not require her to examine what was underneath it. What was underneath it was simpler and heavier. She had been building something for 35 years in the only way available to her. A monument to what those people had done and why it had mattered. A record, as complete and accurate as she could make it, of the historical truth of the work, the organizing, the courage, the specific and patient labor of people who had believed in something and paid a very high price for believing it. She had built it book by book and document by document and photograph by photograph across 35 years of Tuesday mornings and snowstorm days and fundraising drives and roof repairs, and she had placed it in a small-town Ohio library where anyone could walk in off the street and find it. It was the only apology she had known how to make. Harold Finch had recognized it from 40 miles away. She unlocked the library at noon. 3 patrons came in within the first hour, a young mother with a toddler, a retired man who came in every Tuesday for the large print mystery shelf, a high school student who needed a reference book for a history project. Evelyn helped each of them with the same calm efficiency she always brought to the work. Recommended a picture book the toddler hadn't seen. Located the exact volume the student needed, chatted briefly with the retired man about the author whose latest book had just come in. She was present for all of it, fully present. Her hands did not shake, her voice did not waver. But underneath everything, something had shifted in a way that did not have a clean name. Something geological, something that had been in one position for 53 years and was now, after 2 pages of careful handwriting from a dead man who had known where she was for a decade and chosen to wait, in a different position. Not resolved, not healed. Shifted. She closed the library at 5 p.m. She drove home to her small house on Elm Street. She sat in the kitchen and made a cup of tea she did not drink and looked at the letter on the kitchen table. She thought about Harold Finch and the other 2. She knew the other 2 names as well as she knew her own. In the years after 1971, she had thought of them as a kind of permanent accounting, a ledger she kept in her mind, updated whenever she found information, where they were, whether they were well, whether they had families and work, and the ordinary components of a life rebuilt after an injustice. Marcus Webb had died in 1998. Cancer. He had been a carpenter in Birmingham, had a daughter who became a nurse. Evelyn had found his obituary on a library database and had sat with it for a long time. Della Carter was still alive. She was 79, living in Atlanta, had been a social worker for 30 years. Evelyn had found her through a Retired Social Workers Association newsletter of all things 3 years ago. She had not made contact. She had only confirmed that Della Carter was alive and that Della Carter had, by every available measure, built a life. Now Harold Finch was gone, and he had left her a letter that said, "Put it down." She picked up the phone, put it down, picked it up again. She called her daughter. Her daughter's name was Claire. She was 51, lived in Columbus, taught middle school English, had 2 children of her own, who were Evelyn's grandchildren and who came to Crestfield 4 times a year and spent Saturday mornings in the library helping their grandmother with story hour, because they had grown up understanding that the library was not just where their grandmother worked, but what she was. Claire answered on the second ring, said, "Mom, is everything okay?" Evelyn said, "I'm fine. I need to tell you something. It's going to take a while." "Do you have time?" Claire said, "Of course. What's wrong?" Evelyn said, "Nothing is wrong exactly. Something happened today that made me understand that I have been keeping something from you for your entire life. Not to hurt you, because I didn't know how, and because I told myself for a very long time that it didn't matter anymore, and that the person it happened to wasn't who I am anymore." Claire was quiet. Then she said, "Mom, what are you talking about?" Evelyn said, "I'm going to start at the beginning. It's going to take a while. I need you to let me finish before you ask questions." Claire said, "Okay." Evelyn talked for 2 hours. She told Claire about Ohio State and the organizing meetings and the decision to go south in 1968. She told her about the 3 years of work in Alabama and what the work had looked like and what it had required and who she had been while she was doing it. She told her about the name she had used and what it had meant to inhabit it. She told her about April 14th, 1971 and the parking lot and the decision she had made in 30 seconds that she had spent 53 years examining. She told her about Harold Finch, about Marcus Webb, about Della Carter, about the ledger she had kept in her mind for half a century. She told her about the box of donated books and the 1971 almanac and the envelope with the name that had not been spoken aloud in 53 years written on the front in a careful, deliberate hand. She read Claire the letter, all of it, including the part about the civil rights movement collection being the best outside a university library, which made Claire make a sound that was between a laugh and something else. When Evelyn finished, there was a long silence. Then Claire said, "How long have you been carrying this?" Evelyn said, 53 years. Claire said, "Alone?" Evelyn said, "Yes." Another silence. Then Claire said, in a voice that was carefully controlled in the way that people control their voices when they are managing something large, "I need to come to Crestfield this weekend. I need to see you." Evelyn said, "You don't have to." Claire said, "Mom, I need to come to Crestfield." Evelyn said, "All right." That night, after the call ended, Evelyn sat in her kitchen until almost midnight. She had told the story out loud for the first time in 53 years, and the telling had done something she had not expected. Not released her from it, not resolved it, but clarified it in a way that had not been possible when it lived only inside her. When something is only carried internally, it can be managed, compressed, stored in the portion of your mind that handles things that must be carried but cannot be looked at directly. When it is spoken aloud, it becomes a different kind of thing. It takes up different space. It has edges. She was not sure she preferred the edges, but she understood, sitting in her kitchen at midnight with the cold cup of tea on the table, that the edges were necessary. That 53 years of managing something by keeping it shapeless had served a purpose: survival, continuity, the building of a life that had genuine value, and had also cost something that she was only now beginning to understand the full price of. Claire would come on Saturday. That was known. What would happen when Claire came was less certain, and the uncertainty was not frightening exactly, but it was present, the way the cold outside the kitchen window was present, a fact, a condition, something to move through rather than around. She went to bed at midnight. She slept 7 hours, which was more than she had expected. What happened next changed everything. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but in the way that significant things often change everything, which is gradually and then completely, a river changing course, the new direction becoming the only direction that ever made sense. Claire arrived on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. She had driven from Columbus, which was 2 hours, and she had left early enough that the children were still half asleep in the back seat when the car pulled into Evelyn's driveway. They woke up when the engine stopped, the way children wake in cars, instantly, completely, with no transition period. They came inside, they asked for cereal. They ate cereal. Then they went to the library, which was 3 blocks away, and which they had been navigating independently since the elder one was 9, because the library was the safest place in Crestfield, and Evelyn Marsh was its guardian, and no child of hers came to harm there. Evelyn and Claire sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee. Claire looked at her mother for a long moment before she said anything. Evelyn looked back. The light through the kitchen window was the particular flat gray of an Ohio autumn morning, the kind of light that does not flatter anything but illuminates everything with a certain honesty. Claire said, "You look the same." Evelyn said, "I am the same. That's part of what I'm trying to tell you." Claire said, "I've been thinking about the call since Wednesday, about all of it. I didn't sleep well on Wednesday or Thursday." Evelyn said, "I'm sorry." Claire said, "Don't be. I would rather know. Whatever it costs to know, I would rather know than not." This was one of the things about Claire that Evelyn had always recognized as genuinely her daughter's own, this quality of directness, of preferring the difficult true thing to the comfortable false one. She had wondered sometimes where it came from. Now she thought perhaps she knew. They talked for 3 hours, not the 2-hour phone call, a different kind of talking, the kind that happens face to face when there is no distance between the people and no medium through which the conversation is filtered. Claire asked questions Evelyn had not expected. Not about the night of April 14th, not about the legal dimensions or the ethical accounting or any of the things Evelyn had braced herself to navigate. She asked about the work, what it had felt like to do it, what the communities had been like, who the people were, what Evelyn had believed and why. She said, "I never understood why you built the Civil Rights Movement collection the way you did. It always seemed like something more than professional interest. I used to think it was because of Dad, because of his family's history. But it wasn't, was it?" Evelyn said, "No." Claire said, "It was yours." Evelyn said, "Yes." Claire looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she said something that Evelyn had not expected and would not forget. She said, "I think you have been apologizing to those 3 people for 53 years through every book you added to that collection, through every kid you helped with a history project, through every time you stayed open through a snowstorm because somebody needed somewhere to be. I think the library has been your letter back to them, and I think Harold Finch knew that when he said what he said about the collection." Evelyn did not respond immediately. She looked at the letter on the kitchen table between them. Then she said, "I think you might be right." Claire said, "What are you going to do now?" Evelyn said, "I've been thinking about that since Tuesday." She had. She had thought about almost nothing else since Tuesday morning. She had come to a conclusion that frightened her in the precise way that the right things are sometimes frightening, not because they are wrong, but because they are irreversible, because once you do them, they become part of what happened and cannot be undone. She said, I want to tell it, properly, on record, before I die. Claire said, Tell who? Evelyn said, The editor of the paper, and then whoever needs to know after that, the families of the people who were convicted, Della Carter, if she's willing to be found. I want it to be on record that those 3 people were where they were doing what they were doing because it was right, and that what happened to them was wrong, and that I was part of it even in my absence, and that I have known it for 53 years, and chose silence because silence was easier than accountability. I want that to be the record. Claire said, That's going to be hard. Evelyn said yes. Claire said, Are you sure? Evelyn looked at the letter, at Harold Finch's careful handwriting, at the sentence that said, Put it down. She said, I've been sure since Tuesday. I've just been working up to saying it out loud. The editor of the Crestfield Gazette was a man named Daniel Park. He was 34 years old, the son of Korean immigrants who had settled in Crestfield in the 1980s, and he had grown up coming to this library every Saturday morning with his mother, who had used the English language collection to supplement the language classes she was taking at the community center. He had a specific and personal memory of Evelyn Marsh, the patience of her, the way she had always had time, the way she had helped his mother navigate a collection in a language his mother was still learning, that made him one of the people for whom the word librarian and the word Evelyn were effectively synonymous. When she called and asked to speak with him, he said, Of course, whenever suits you. She said, This week if possible. I have a story I need to tell before I die. I've been waiting 53 years to tell it correctly. A silence. Then he said, I'll come to you. He came to the library on a Wednesday afternoon after closing time. Evelyn had set up 2 chairs at the table in the small reading room at the back, the room with the good lamp and the civil rights movement collection on the shelf along one wall. She had made tea. She had placed Harold Finch's letter on the table between the 2 chairs. Daniel Park sat down. He had a notebook and a recorder. He looked at the collection on the shelf behind Evelyn's chair, the carefully organized volumes, the photographs, the primary source documents she had collected and preserved across 35 years. He had looked at that collection 100 times. He looked at it differently now. She said, I'm going to tell you everything. I need you to promise me 2 things, that you'll tell it accurately, and that you'll find the families of the people who were convicted before you publish anything, and give them the opportunity to respond. He said, I promise both. She said, and one more thing. He said, yes. She said, Harold Finch forgave me before I ever asked. I want his family to know that I received the letter, that it reached me, that it did what he intended it to do. Daniel Park looked at the letter on the table. He said, I'll make sure they know. She began. She talked for 2.5 hours. Daniel Park did not interrupt. He took notes in a small, precise hand and let the recorder run and listened with the focused attention of someone who understands that certain things are only told once and that the telling is the trust. She told it the way she had told it to Claire, starting at the beginning at Ohio State in 1964 and moving forward through everything in order. She did not minimize, she did not editorialize. She stated what had happened and what she had done and what she had chosen and what it had cost and what 53 years of carrying it looked like from the inside. When she reached April 14, 1971, she told it plainly. The meeting, the confrontation, leaving to retrieve documents, the parking lot, the shot, the decision in 30 seconds, the drive north. She said, I was not in the room when the shot was fired. That is true. I was also part of the infrastructure that brought everyone to that room on that night. I cannot separate my absence from the event, from my presence in everything that led to it. I have tried for 53 years. It cannot be separated. Daniel Park said, "Do you believe you committed a crime?" She said, "I believe I made a choice that had consequences for 3 people who deserved better from me. Whether that meets a legal definition is not something I am qualified to determine. What I can tell you is what it meets morally, and what it meets morally is a failure. A failure I have been accounting for in the only ways available to me, which were not enough, which is why I am telling you now." He said, "Why now specifically?" She touched the letter on the table. She said, "Because a man I wronged chose to forgive me before I asked. And he put the forgiveness where I would find it when I was ready. And I think the least I can do with that gift is use it correctly." Daniel Park wrote the story over the following 2 weeks. He did exactly what he had promised. He contacted the families of all 3 convicted persons before publishing a word. Marcus Webb's daughter, the nurse from Birmingham, Harold Finch's children, 4 of them, scattered across Ohio and Pennsylvania, Della Carter herself in Atlanta. Della Carter called Evelyn directly, 3 days before the story ran. Evelyn answered the phone and heard a voice she had not heard in 53 years, a voice that was older and deeper and carried the specific quality of a person who has survived things and processed them and arrived on the other side of the processing at something like equanimity. Della said, "I heard you were telling the story." Evelyn said, "Yes." Della said, "Good. It needs to be told." A pause. Then Evelyn said, "I'm sorry, for all of it, for leaving, for the years of silence." Della said, "I know you are. I've known it for a long time. Some things you can see from a distance, even without being told." Evelyn said, "How did you?" Della said, "Because of the collection. I looked it up after Daniel Park's researcher called me. Your Civil Rights Movement collection. I went through the catalog online. Every primary source document you have, the photographs, the oral history archives. You've been building a monument to what we were doing for 35 years and putting it where anyone could walk in off the street and access it. I know what that is. That's not a hobby. That's a conversation you've been having with people you couldn't speak to directly." Evelyn was quiet. Della said, "It's all right. I want you to hear that from me directly, not in a letter from somebody who's gone. It's all right. We came through, both of us, not without cost, but through." Daniel Park came back to the library twice before the story ran, to verify details and to read quotes back to her for confirmation. He was careful and thorough in the way that good journalists are careful and thorough, not seeking drama, not constructing a narrative that required the facts to cooperate, but following the facts wherever they went and representing them accurately. He had been a journalist for 11 years. He had covered local government and school board meetings and the occasional crime story and the slow economic news of a small Ohio town for most of that time. He told her, on his second visit, that this was the most important story he had written in 11 years, and that he understood the weight of that, and took it seriously. She said, "I know you do. That's why I called you." He said, "Can I ask you something off the record?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Why now? You could have told this story at any point in 35 years. Why this specific moment?" She thought about the question. Then she said, "I'm 78 years old, and a man who had every reason to be angry with me chose to forgive me instead, and chose to put the forgiveness somewhere I would find it. and chose to wait patiently for me to find it, and then died before he could know whether I had. I think the least I can do with that is use it. Tell the story he made it possible to tell. Name the people he was with, who deserved naming. Put it on record before I also run out of time. Daniel Park wrote that down. He said, "I'm going to include that." "Is that all right?" She said, "Yes, that's all right." That's the true answer. When the story ran, it occupied the front page of the Crestfield Gazette and was picked up by the Associated Press within 48 hours. Not because it was sensational. Daniel Park had written it with the same careful precision Evelyn had asked for, accurate and complete and without manufactured drama. It was picked up because it was true in a way that certain true things are, the kind of truth that resonates beyond its specific details into something more general, something about time and silence and the weight of carried things, and what happens when the carrying finally ends. The story ran on a Friday. By Sunday, it had been picked up by 3 regional papers. By Monday, the Associated Press had it. By Tuesday, her phone had rung enough times that she had turned the ringer off and was checking messages in batches. The messages came from everywhere. From journalists, from historians, from civil rights organizations, from people who had been involved in organizing in that era who recognized elements of the story, the specific details, the geographic contours, the names of people and places that only someone who had been present would know. From younger people, some of them descendants of people involved in the movement, who wrote with a careful and specific gratitude that Evelyn received with equal care. From people who had simply read the story and needed to say something about it and chose her as the recipient of that need. From Della Carter's daughter, who called on Saturday to say that her mother had wept while reading the story and asked if Evelyn would be willing to speak with her directly. Evelyn said yes immediately before she had fully processed the question. From a law professor at Howard University who had spent 20 years working on post-conviction cases from the civil rights era and who wanted to discuss the legal record of the 1971 conviction and whether grounds existed for posthumous exoneration. Evelyn gave him everything she had, the dates, the names, the documentation she had spent 35 years accumulating in the collection she had built partly for exactly this purpose. She had not known that when she built it. She understood it now, from Harold Finch's eldest son, who called to thank her and who said quietly, near the end of the call, he talked about that time his whole life. He said it was the most important thing he ever did. He would have been glad you told it. Evelyn's phone rang for 3 days. She answered some calls and did not answer others. She gave one additional interview to a journalist from Columbus who had covered civil rights history for 20 years and who asked questions that required the full precision of everything she knew. She did not close the library during any of this. The library stayed open. She was there every morning when it opened and every evening when it closed. The patrons came as they always came. The Tuesday morning toddlers for story hour, the retired man for his large print mysteries, the high school students for reference books, the young mothers, the older men, the people who needed somewhere quiet to be. Some of them had read the story, some had not. The ones who had mostly said nothing directly. A longer look, a hand briefly on her arm, a nod that carried more than its usual weight. Crestfield was a small town. It had known Evelyn Marsh for 35 years. It was deciding, in the particular way that small towns decide things, what to do with the new information. What it decided as a whole and over time was this: not much needed to change. The woman who had been the librarian was still the librarian. What she had carried in private did not alter what she had given in public. It added to it, complicated it, made it more rather than less. The library was still the library. The collection on the civil rights movement shelf was still the best outside a university collection, as Harold Finch had noted. This was not a unanimous or uncomplicated decision. There were people in Crestfield who had opinions about what had happened in 1971 that were different from Evelyn's account of it, who found the story less straightforward than Daniel Park's telling, who felt that 53 years of silence constituted something that required more examination than the article had given it. These people existed. Their opinions were real. Evelyn did not dismiss them and did not argue with them. When Mrs. Hartman from the County Historical Society came in the week after the story ran and said that she had questions about the legal record that the article had not addressed, Evelyn sat with her for an hour and answered every question with the same patience and precision she brought to everything. She did not defend herself beyond the facts. She did not perform remorse for the benefit of an audience. She stated what had happened and what she had done and what she believed about it, and she let Mrs. Hartman make of that what she would. Mrs. Hartman left after an hour. She did not say what she had concluded. She came back the following Tuesday and returned a book she had borrowed 2 weeks ago, which was The Ordinary Transaction of an Ordinary Patron, which was perhaps also a form of verdict. Evelyn accepted the returned book and checked it in and placed it on the reshelving cart and thanked Mrs. Hartman, and meant the thanks genuinely, which was the only way she knew how to mean things. What changed was Evelyn, not visibly, not in ways the patrons would have noticed or named immediately, but in the specific interior way that things change when a weight you have carried for so long it has become part of your posture is, very slowly, set down. She noticed it in small things, in the way she moved through the library in the mornings before it opened, doing the opening routine she had done for 35 years, unlocking the doors, turning on the lights, checking the returns drop, starting the coffee maker she kept at the circulation desk, walking the floor in the particular order she had developed across thousands of mornings. She had always done this efficiently, professionally, with the focused forward movement of someone who has things to do and does them. She still did it that way, but something underneath the efficiency was different, less effortful, as if a small engine that had been running continuously for 53 years, not loud, not obtrusive, just always running, always consuming some portion of her available energy, had been switched off. She noticed it in the way she listened to people. She had always been a good listener. It was part of the job, and she had cultivated it deliberately. But there had always been, beneath the listening, a faint awareness of herself as a listener, a faint consciousness of the performance of attention, even when the attention was genuine. That awareness was quieter now. The listening was more simply itself. She noticed it most clearly on the second Tuesday after the story ran, during story hour, when she was reading to a group of 12 toddlers in the reading room. She was reading a picture book about a girl who plants a garden and tends it across the seasons and sees it through winter to spring, which was a book she had read to 100 story-hour groups across the years, which she knew so well she could have read it with her eyes closed. She looked up from the page at the circle of small faces looking back at her, 12 children between 18 months and 3 years, in various states of attention ranging from rapt to distracted to half asleep. and she felt something that took her a moment to identify. Simply glad to be there. Not glad in the qualified way she had been glad for 35 years, glad that the work existed, and glad that she was able to do it. Glad with the consciousness of why it was necessary and what it was compensating for. Simply glad. Present. In a room with 12 small children and a picture book about a garden, on a Tuesday morning in Crestfield, Ohio. It was a very small thing. It was also enormous. Harold Finch's daughter came on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the story ran. Her name was Patricia. She was 58, a retired teacher like her father, and she drove 6 hours from her home in western Pennsylvania to a small library in Crestfield, Ohio, to meet a woman she had read about in a newspaper and whose name her father had apparently known for 10 years without telling his children. She walked in at 10:15 a.m. on a Thursday. The library was quiet. A retired man was at the large print mystery shelf. A young woman with a laptop was at one of the reading tables. Patricia Finch stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the space, at the shelves, at the card catalog in the corner that nobody had removed because it had been there too long to remove, at the Civil Rights Movement collection visible through the open door of the reading room at the back. Evelyn was behind the circulation desk. She looked up when the door opened, the way she always looked up, the way that 35 years of this work had made automatic. She saw Patricia Finch and knew immediately who she was, not from photographs. She had not seen photographs, from the way she stood, from the quality of attention in her face, from something that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with the specific gravity of a person who has come to a place for a reason they have been carrying a long time. Patricia Finch walked to the circulation desk. She looked at Evelyn for a long moment. Then she said, "My father said you had kind eyes." He was right. Evelyn set down the book she was holding. She came around the circulation desk. The two women looked at each other in the morning light of a small Ohio library. Then Patricia Finch said, "He talked about that time his whole life. Not bitterly. He wasn't a bitter man. But he talked about it the way people talk about the things that shaped them most completely. He said it was the most important thing he ever did, even with the prison, even with everything that came after. He said the work was right." Evelyn said, "It was." Patricia said, "He knew you were carrying guilt about leaving. He said he could feel it in the collection, in the way you'd built it, in what you'd chosen to include. He said it was like someone writing a letter in the only language they had available." Evelyn said, "Your father was a remarkable man." Patricia said, "He was. And he thought you were too. He just wanted you to know that the carrying was over. They closed the library for the rest of the day. Not for grief, not for crisis, but because some things require the full attention of the present moment and cannot be done alongside the routine of ordinary hours." They sat in the reading room at the back, in the 2 chairs under the good lamp with the Civil Rights Movement collection on the shelf above them, and they talked for 4 hours. Patricia told Evelyn about her father's life after 1975, the teaching, the church, the grandchildren, the fishing, the particular way he had rebuilt himself from something that should have been unbuildable. Evelyn told Patricia about the 3 years in Alabama, about the work, about who Harold Finch had been in those years when he was not yet the man his children knew, but the person he was becoming. They shared him between them, the young man and the old one, the person before and the person after, the whole person that neither of them alone had possessed. When Patricia left at 4 p.m., she embraced Evelyn at the door. Then she held her at arm's length and said, One more thing. My father wanted to know, and he wrote it in a note to me to be opened after he died. He wanted to know if the section on Alabama organizing in your collection had the Foreman documents, the 1970 ones. Evelyn said, "Third shelf, left side. Original copies, not reproductions." Patricia laughed. It was a real laugh, deep and genuine, with her father's particular quality in it, the quality of someone who finds the right things funny. She said, "He said you'd have them." She left. Evelyn stood in the library doorway and watched her car pull out of the small parking lot and turn onto the main street and disappear in the direction of the highway. Then she went back inside. She walked to the Civil Rights Movement collection. She stood in front of the shelves for a long time, looking at the spines of the books and documents she had assembled across 35 years. The oral history archives, the photographs, the primary source documents. The Foreman documents, third shelf, left side. She reached up and straightened a volume that was slightly out of alignment. The motion was automatic. The motion of someone who has tended something for a very long time. Then she did something she had not done in this room in many years. She sat down in one of the reading chairs and looked at the collection from that angle. The reader's angle, the patron's angle, the angle of someone who has come in off the street needing something and found it here. She sat there for a long time. The library was quiet. The afternoon light came through the windows in the particular way it came through these windows, the angle she had watched shift across 35 years of seasons, the specific quality of Ohio light in early autumn, clear and cool and without sentimentality. She was 78 years old. She had been someone else before she was herself. She had carried something heavy for a very long time. A man she had wronged had found her and forgiven her, and placed the forgiveness in the last place she would have thought to look, and the perfect place she would inevitably find it. She was still the librarian. She would be the librarian until she could not be any more. She would keep the collection and the story hour and the open doors during snowstorms and the large print mystery shelf and the patience for the people who needed somewhere quiet to be. But she was also, for the first time in 53 years, something else. She was a person who had set down a weight, not finished, not resolved, not healed in the clean way that the word healing implies, but different. The specific difference that comes when something that has shaped your posture for so long you forgot it was shaping your posture is finally, with the full permission of someone whose permission mattered, released. She thought about what Claire had said. The library has been your letter back to them. She thought about what Della Carter had said. That's a conversation you've been having with people you couldn't speak to directly. She thought about what Harold Finch had written. Put it down. She thought about Patricia Finch's laugh, real and deep, with her father's quality in it. When Evelyn said the Foreman documents were on the third shelf, left side, original copies, she thought about the high school student from last Tuesday who had needed a reference book for a history project on the Civil Rights Movement, and whom Evelyn had walked to the third shelf and showed exactly where to look, the way she had done hundreds of times across 35 years, the way she would continue to do, the way that was both the smallest and the most important thing she did each day. She thought about Harold Finch sitting in some other library 40 miles away, going through catalog after catalog, looking for the Foreman documents, finding them finally here in Crestfield. She thought about him closing his laptop or closing the catalog and sitting for a moment with the knowledge that she had them. Original copies, that she had found them and preserved them and made them available and cared for them the way you care for things that matter. She thought, he knew. Before the letter, before any of this. He had looked at what she built, and he had known. That was, she decided, a form of being seen that she had not expected and did not know how to fully receive yet. It would take time. Most things worth receiving took time. She picked up the book she had been meaning to read all week. A new acquisition. A history of the Selma campaigns, just arrived. She opened it to the first page. The dedication read, "For everyone who showed up, for everyone who stayed." She read, "If this story reached something in you, something about the things we carry and the people who carry them in silence, and the strange and specific mercy of being forgiven before you thought to ask, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear it today. And if you believe that some truths deserve to be told, no matter how long they've been waiting, subscribe to Beyond the Silence. Because there are more people like Evelyn, more letters waiting in more almanacs, more weights waiting to be set down, and every one of them deserves to be heard."